A millionaire found 2 newborn black girls outside his office. A few days later, a nurse broke into his office door. The morning light filtered through the glass facade of Vision AI's headquarters, painting soft amber streaks across the polished marble floor. The quiet hum of Silicon Valley was a backdrop Richard Clarke had grown accustomed to, always purposeful, always moving. His mind was already on the agenda for the day, an investor meeting at 10, a review of the new neural network project at noon, and a conference call by evening. It was a routine he thrived on. The revolving door clicked softly behind him as he stepped into the crisp morning air. Richard adjusted the cuff of his tailored jacket, his stride steady. The soft murmur of passing employees and the occasional metallic tap of someone's hurried steps blended into a rhythm he didn't have to think about. That was, until it stopped. "Sir?" The voice of his assistant, Linda, broke the morning stillness. She stood a few feet ahead, hesitating near the entrance. Something in her posture, tense, uncertain, caught his attention. "What is it?" Richard asked, quickening his pace. "It's, this." Linda gestured awkwardly toward the building's glass doorway. 2 wicker baskets sat on the ground, side by side, incongruous against the sleek modern architecture of Vision AI. For a moment, Richard thought they might be part of some peculiar delivery, perhaps promotional samples or an elaborate prank. But as he drew closer, the sound hit him first. A faint whimper, delicate and raw. He froze mid-step, his gaze locking onto the baskets. Linda shuffled uneasily, her fingers tightening around the edge of her tablet. "Are those—" His voice trailed off. She nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Babies, sir. 2 of them." Richard moved closer, his sharp gaze narrowing. The baskets were simple, lined with soft blankets that shifted slightly with movement. He crouched, peeling back the fabric with careful precision, as though afraid too much force might shatter whatever fragile moment this was. Inside lay 2 black infants, no more than a month old. One was wide awake, her dark, round eyes scanning her surroundings with an almost curious intensity. The other stirred faintly, her tiny fists curling against the fabric before settling back into sleep. A slip of paper pinned to the edge of one basket caught his attention. He unfolded it, his brow furrowing as he read the brief message. "Protect them, Janice and Janet. Please." "Protect them," Richard murmured, translating the words instinctively. His fingers lingered on the note, the hurried scrawl of the handwriting almost as compelling as the message itself. Behind him, Linda spoke again, her voice tentative. "Should I call?" "No," he interrupted, standing. His eyes never left the baskets. Linda blinked. "No. Sir, this is—" "Not yet," Richard said, his tone measured but firm. He ran a hand through his neatly combed hair, his thoughts moving faster than his words. "Not until we know more. But these children weren't left here randomly." He gestured toward the note. "Whoever did this, they wanted them to be found. Here." Linda hesitated before nodding, though the concern in her eyes didn't fade. "Should I contact security?" "Yes," Richard replied. "Have Carlos pull the exterior footage. I want to know who left them and when." As Linda moved away to make the call, Richard crouched again, his expression softening. The awake infant, the one with the curious eyes, reached out, her tiny fingers curling toward the edge of his sleeve. For a man whose life revolved around precision and calculation, the touch was disarming. A moment passed before Linda returned, her voice a shade calmer. "Carlos is on it. He'll have an update soon." "Good." Richard stood, gathering the blankets around the babies to shield them from the chill of the morning air. "Bring my car around. I'm taking them home." "Home?" Linda's brow arched in surprise. "Yes, home," he repeated, his tone leaving no room for discussion. "Until we understand what's happening here, they're safer with me." Her lips parted as though to protest, but she caught herself. Instead, she nodded, muttering, "Right away, sir." As Linda disappeared inside, Richard lifted the baskets carefully, one in each arm. The weight was surprising, solid, but not overwhelming. The babies made faint noises of protest before settling again, the warmth of the blankets soothing them. Standing there, cradling the two tiny lives that had so abruptly entered his orbit, Richard felt a strange stillness take root in him. It wasn't uncertainty or fear, but something quieter, an obligation that went beyond logic or strategy. The sound of a sleek black car approaching the curb interrupted his thoughts. Richard moved quickly, placing the baskets gently in the back seat before sliding into the driver's seat himself. As the engine purred to life, he glanced at the rearview mirror. The awake infant's eyes met his once more, wide and unblinking. For a fleeting moment, Richard thought he saw something there. Trust, perhaps, or expectation. "Let's find out who you are," he murmured, his voice low but resolute. And with that, he drove off, leaving the quiet hum of Vision AI behind. The silence of Richard Clarke's mansion, usually a haven for his meticulously ordered life, now hummed with the occasional soft cry of babies. The vast living room had transformed overnight. Furniture was pushed aside to make space for two portable cribs, stacks of blankets, and an assortment of hastily purchased baby supplies. The faint scent of talcum powder mixed oddly with the crisp, sterile scent of the home's polished wood floors. Richard stood at the edge of the room, his tailored jacket draped over a chair, sleeves rolled up as he fiddled awkwardly with a diaper. Janet, the more restless of the two, squirmed on the padded changing table he'd set up in place of the antique sideboard. "You're not making this easy for me," he muttered under his breath. Janet kicked her legs in response, the Velcro straps of the diaper refusing to align properly. Linda entered with a tray of warm bottles, raising an eyebrow at the scene. "Need help, sir?" "No," Richard replied curtly, though the sigh that followed betrayed his frustration. "I can figure this out." Linda set the tray on a nearby table, her professional demeanor cracking just slightly as she watched him wrestle with the task. "I can see that," she said, crossing her arms. "You know, they don't come with a manual." "Clearly," Richard replied dryly, but a faint smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. After another minute of concentrated effort, the diaper was finally secured, albeit slightly lopsided. Janet let out a contented coo, her tiny hands grasping at the air. "There," Richard said, stepping back and nodding at his own handiwork. "Problem solved." "Until the next one," Linda quipped, motioning toward Janice, who had begun to stir in her crib. Richard shot her a look, but said nothing, walking over to gently lift Janice. The baby nestled into the crook of his arm, without fuss, her warmth a reminder of just how small and fragile she was. He carried her to a rocking chair by the window, the light filtering through the gauzy curtains, casting a soft glow over the room. "How long until Carlos finds something?" he asked, his voice quieter now, more introspective. Linda leaned against the edge of the table, crossing her arms. "He's reviewing the footage, but so far it's not promising. Whoever left them knew how to avoid the cameras." Richard frowned, his gaze shifting to the note now pinned to the wall beside his desk. The scrawled Vietnamese words stared back at him, as enigmatic as the twins themselves. "Do you think they'll come back?" Linda asked after a pause. Richard's jaw tightened. "I don't know." He rocked Janice gently, the rhythmic motion calming both of them. "But whoever left them wanted them to be found. Here, by me." Linda nodded, though her expression remained skeptical. "It doesn't make sense. Why you? There are plenty of people who could have... Because they think I can protect them, Richard interrupted, his tone firm. And until we know otherwise, that's exactly what I'll do. The quiet determination in his voice left no room for argument. Linda turned to leave, but before she reached the door, Richard called after her. "Have Carlos double the patrols around the property," he said, his eyes never leaving the infant in his arms. "And tell him to keep digging. There's something we're missing." "Yes, sir." The door clicked shut behind her, leaving Richard alone with the twins. Janice's breathing had slowed, her tiny fist curled against his chest. Across the room, Janet let out a soft murmur from her crib, but didn't stir. For a man who had spent his life navigating the complexities of technology and business, the simplicity of this moment was oddly grounding. Yet, it was laced with an unease he couldn't shake. The twins had been left on his doorstep for a reason, but that reason remained maddeningly elusive. Outside, the grounds of the mansion stretched wide and immaculate. Manicured hedges bordered the long driveway, and a fountain burbled softly in the center of the circular front garden. Beyond the gates, however, the world seemed to loom closer than usual. Shadows stretched longer in the fading daylight, and the distant hum of traffic felt unnervingly intrusive. From a second-story window, a faint movement caught the light. A flicker, barely noticeable. Richard glanced up instinctively, his sharp eyes scanning the tree line beyond the perimeter. Nothing. Janice stirred against him, pulling him back into the room. He exhaled, brushing it off as an overactive imagination. But as he settled her back into her crib and turned out the light, the uneasy feeling remained, gnawing at the edges of his thoughts. Somewhere out there, someone was watching. He could feel it. The soft chime of Vision AI's front doors, sliding open, echoed through the vast, glassy lobby. Richard stood in his office, overlooking the city as the late afternoon sun dipped lower, casting long streaks of amber across his minimalist desk. A knock at the door drew his attention. "Come in," he said, his tone distracted, his thoughts still tangled in the puzzle of the twins. The door opened hesitantly, and Linda entered first, her usually steady demeanor uncharacteristically cautious. Behind her was a woman, slim, pale, and visibly worn. Her dark hair, pulled hastily into a ponytail, framed a face lined with exhaustion and something deeper, fear. She clutched a canvas tote bag against her chest like a shield. "Mr. Clark," Linda began, stepping aside. "This is Valerie. She says it's about the babies." Richard turned, his gaze sharp as he studied the woman. Valerie shifted under the weight of his scrutiny, but stepped forward. I'm sorry to just show up like this. I didn't know where else to go." "You're the one who left them?" Richard asked, his voice steady, but edged with urgency. "Yes," Valerie said quickly, her hands tightening on the bag's strap. "But I have reason." "Difficult to say." Richard gestured toward the chair across from his desk. "Sit." Valerie hesitated, then sank into the chair, her movements deliberate, as though she carried the weight of something she hadn't decided to put down yet. Richard remained standing, his arms crossed, waiting. "It's a long story," she began, her voice faltering slightly. "But you need to know. They're not safe, not without someone like you." Richard said, "Lead from the beginning." His tone wasn't harsh, but it brooked no delay. Valerie took a deep breath, glancing briefly at Linda, who gave her a small nod before leaving and closing the door. "Their mother," Valerie began, her hands twisting the strap of her bag. "Her name was Megan. She was only 23. She came to the hospital, where I work, alone, in labor. There was no one with her. No family, no friends." Richard leaned against his desk, his sharp eyes unwavering. "She delivered them, Janet and Janice. After hours of complications, Valerie continued, her voice tightening. But there was too much bleeding. We did everything we could, but... She looked down, unable to finish. So, she died, Richard said quietly, filling the silence. Valerie nodded. Yes. She was barely conscious near the end. But before she... Her voice cracked, but she pushed on. Before she passed, she told me one thing. Keep them safe. I didn't understand what she meant until later. Richard frowned. Safe from what? Valerie's knuckles whitened against the strap. There's a man named Keith Reed. He runs a network. She spoke carefully, as if each word had its own significance. They target babies like Janet and Janice, orphans, especially those who are harder to trace. They sell them, mostly overseas. Wealthy families who want children, but there's more. She hesitated, the words catching in her throat. More? Richard pressed. Valerie whispered. They're not just sold as adoptees. They're groomed to be servants. As soon as they're old enough. A heavy silence filled the room, broken only by the distant hum of city traffic beyond the glass. How do you know this? Richard finally asked. Valerie straightened, her resolve hardening. I overheard them in hospital, Reed and one of his people, talking in the hospital. They were planning to take Janet and Janice the moment they were discharged. Megan knew something was wrong. That's why she begged me. So you ran, Richard said, his tone even, but with an edge of understanding. Yes, Valerie admitted. I didn't know what else to do. I thought, maybe I could call the authorities, but Reed has people everywhere. They'd have found me before anything happened. And the babies... Her voice broke, but she continued. Then I saw your name in the papers. All the work you've done with orphans, your donations. I thought if I left them with you, you could protect them in a way I couldn't. Richard stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he moved to his desk, leaning both hands against it as he considered her words. You should have come to me sooner, he said finally. Valerie looked up sharply, the guilt in her eyes flickering. I didn't know if you'd believe me. If you'd even care. I care, Richard said simply, his voice firm. But this doesn't end with them sitting in my house. Reed is still out there, and as long as he is, they're not safe. Neither are you. Valerie swallowed hard, nodding. I know. Richard stood, his gaze hardening with resolve. I'll need everything you know, names, places, anything. If we're going to protect them, we can't just wait for Reed to come to us. A flicker of relief crossed Valerie's face, though it didn't erase the tension in her shoulders. I'll tell you everything. Good, Richard said, his tone final, because this isn't over. As Valerie sat back, exhaustion etched into every line of her face, the weight of the moment settled over both of them. Outside, the sun dipped below the skyline, shadows stretching across the city. Somewhere in those shadows, Richard knew, Reed was watching, and Richard would be ready. The mansion felt colder than Valerie had expected, despite its luxurious warmth. The soft crackle of the fireplace in the living room couldn't quite reach the edges of her unease. She stood by the large bay window, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, staring at the manicured lawn bathed in pale morning light. The glass reflected her face back at her, tired, hollow-eyed, and worn from days of running. Behind her, Richard's low voice carried from the nursery, firm, but oddly soft. Hold still, he said, almost like a command, but tempered with patience. A muffled whimper followed, then the rustle of fabric as he adjusted one of the twins. Valerie turned, watching as Richard crouched near Janet's crib, a burp cloth draped over his shoulder. His movements were precise, deliberate, traits likely honed in boardrooms, but now applied to the delicate task of soothing a restless infant. "You're better at that than I expected," Valerie said quietly, her voice breaking the silence. Richard glanced up, his expression neutral but with the faintest hint of amusement. "There is a significant learning curve." Valerie managed a thin smile, but it quickly faded. Her hands tightened around her arms, the weight of guilt pressing down again. "Are you eating?" Richard asked abruptly, standing and settling Janet back into her crib. The question startled her. She blinked. Yeah, I'm fine." That wasn't an answer. He approached, folding the burp cloth neatly and setting it aside. His gaze was sharp, not unkind but unyielding. "Taking care of yourself is crucial if you plan to stay here. You can't assist them if you're depleted of energy." She looked away, her jaw tightening. "I'm not exactly used to this. Staying in a place like this. Trusting someone else to handle everything." "Get used to it," he said bluntly, but his tone lacked malice. She turned back to the window, her reflection fractured by the light streaming through. "I can't stop thinking about Megan," she admitted. "I promised her I'd keep them safe, and all I've done is drag them into more danger." "You did what you thought was right," Richard replied, "and now we do what we can." His certainty didn't erase her doubts, but it steadied her, if only slightly. By midday, Carlos arrived with updates. The head of security, a solid man with a calm demeanor, placed a folder on Richard's desk. Valerie lingered by the doorway, hesitant to intrude, but too anxious to stay away. "It's thin," Carlos admitted, flipping open the folder. "Whoever dropped them off knew what they were doing. No cameras caught a clear face or license plate. The footage gives us nothing but a blurry figure in a hoodie." Richard frowned, leaning over the desk to study the still images. "What about the area around the hospital? Anything linking Reed there?" "Rumors," Carlos said. "Quiet ones. Reed doesn't leave trails. He leaves whispers. People are too scared to talk." Valerie stepped closer, her voice trembling but determined. "If they're too scared, it means they know something. We just have to push harder." Carlos glanced at her, then back to Richard. "We'll keep at it. In the meantime, I've doubled the patrols around the property, like you asked. If Reed or his people try anything, we'll know." Richard nodded, but his frown deepened. "It's not enough. He's already watching." Carlos tilted his head. "You're sure?" "Call it instinct," Richard said. "Someone's out there, waiting for us to slip up." That evening, the mansion seemed to exhale with an uneasy stillness. Valerie sat on the edge of the sofa, her hands gripping a steaming cup of tea that Linda had brought her. Across the room, Richard worked quietly at his desk, the glow of his laptop casting sharp shadows on his face. The twins were asleep upstairs, their soft breaths monitored by baby cams Richard had insisted on installing. But Valerie couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She glanced toward the window, her heartbeat quickening as she thought she saw movement among the trees at the edge of the property. She set the cup down carefully, rising to get a closer look. The shadows outside blurred with the twilight, leaves swaying gently in the breeze. It could have been nothing, a trick of the light. However, the instinct that had prompted her to escape the hospital tightened her chest. "Something wrong." Richard's voice cut through her thoughts. She turned sharply, her heart jumping. "No," she said too quickly. "It's nothing." He studied her for a moment, his gaze sharp, but not probing. "Let me know if that changes." She nodded, returning to her seat, but her hands fidgeted with the hem of her sweater. She wanted to tell him what she thought she'd seen, but the fear of being wrong and the fear of being right kept her silent. Outside, the shadows deepened as night fell. In the quiet hum of the mansion, The sense of safety felt more fragile than ever. Valerie lies awake that night, staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the image of the trees swaying in the fading light. Somewhere out there, she knows Reed is watching. But how close? She isn't ready to say it aloud yet, not even to herself. Days at the mansion began to settle into an uneasy rhythm. Mornings started with the soft cries of Janet or Janice, their small voices echoing through the grand hallways. Richard often found himself in the nursery first, his sleeves already rolled up, handling tasks with an efficiency that masked the tenderness growing within him. This morning, Valerie sat on the carpeted floor, cradling Janice, while Janet lay nearby, swaddled and staring at the ceiling with wide, curious eyes. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, illuminating the nursery's newly added touches: stuffed animals, pastel mobiles, and a rocking chair Richard had personally assembled. "She's fascinated by the ceiling," Richard observed, his voice breaking the quiet as he walked in. Valerie glanced up, smiling faintly. "It's the light. It dances when the breeze hits the curtains." He leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, watching her. The way she held Janice, her touch instinctively gentle, made him wonder what her life had been like before this chaos. "You're good with them," he said, his voice neutral but sincere. Valerie looked down at Janice, her expression softening. "It's different when they're this small. They don't ask for much, just to be safe." The simplicity of her words was not matched by the weight of her voice. "Did you always want kids?" Richard asked, stepping further into the room. The question took her aback. She paused, adjusting Janice in her arms. "I don't know. Maybe. But life doesn't always go the way you plan." She gave him a sidelong glance. "I imagine you didn't plan for this either." "Not at all," he admitted, crouching down to adjust Janet's swaddle. "But here we are." The room settled into a companionable silence. Janet made a soft cooing noise, drawing a small smile from Richard. "You mentioned your father before," he said after a moment. "Aaron, wasn't it?" Valerie stiffened slightly, but she didn't look away. "Yeah, he's at a nursing home now, early onset dementia. He has good days and bad days." Richard tilted his head. "Was it just the two of you?" "For a long time," she said. "My mum died when I was 12. Car accident. Dad did his best, but life wasn't easy for him after that." Her voice wavered slightly, but she pushed on. "I went into nursing because of him, actually. He always said I had a knack for taking care of people." Richard studied her, noting the way her fingers tightened on Janice's blanket. "He must be proud of you." She smiled faintly, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I hope so." By mid-afternoon, Carlos arrived, his presence as steady and unshakable as ever. He carried a slim folder under one arm, his expression as grave as the contents likely were. "I've got something," he said, as he stepped into Richard's office, nodding briefly to Valerie, who lingered near the door. "Let's hear it," Richard said, gesturing for him to sit. Carlos opened the folder, spreading out a series of photographs and notes. "Reed's network is larger than we thought. He's tied to several trafficking circles that operate internationally. The scary part, he doesn't just move people, he uses them to infiltrate legitimate organizations, hospitals, adoption agencies, even charities." Valerie's stomach churned as she leaned closer to the table, her eyes scanning the images. "So, he's everywhere." "Not quite," Carlos said, "but close enough. The hospital where you worked, it wasn't a random target. Reed had people on the inside." Richard's jaw tightened. "And the mansion?" Carlos hesitated. "No direct threats yet. But there are signs we're being watched. A car parked outside the gates for too long. Strange activity on the security feeds." "Reed is testing us," Richard said, his voice low but certain. "Exactly," Carlos replied. "He's waiting to see how much we know before he makes a move." That evening, Valerie sat by the window in her room, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. The mansion felt impossibly quiet, but the tension in the air was palpable. She had told herself she wouldn't check her messages, wouldn't risk the reminder of what lay beyond these walls. But when her phone buzzed, the resolve crumbled. She unlocked the screen, her breath catching at the sight of an unknown number. The message was short, but the weight of it hit her like a blow. "Stay out of this, or Aaron won't be so lucky." Her hands trembled as she stared at the words. She glanced toward the hallway, where the soft sounds of Richard moving about could be heard. For a moment, she considered telling him, but the image of her father, his frail hands, his vacant yet sometimes lucid gaze, stopped her. She couldn't jeopardize his position in this game. With a shaky breath, she deleted the message and turned off her phone. Her decision weighed heavily in her chest. In the darkness outside her window, the shadows seemed to stretch further, creeping closer to the safety of the mansion. Somewhere, Reed's eyes were watching, waiting. The hospital smelled the same. Antiseptic, faintly floral air fresheners, and the distinct sterility that marked every corridor. Valerie adjusted her badge as she walked through the familiar halls, but each step felt heavier than the last. She was back, though she didn't want to be. Keith Reed's threats clung to her thoughts like a fog, and the memory of the text haunted her every move. "Valerie, you're back!" a colleague called from behind the nurse's station. She forced a tight smile. "Just for today. Couldn't stay away from the chaos, I guess." The other nurse chuckled, too busy sorting files to notice Valerie's distant tone. She nodded politely and moved toward the maternity ward, her chest tightening as she approached the wing where it had all begun. Reed had people here. Carlos's words echoed in her mind. And then there was the text. She gripped her phone tighter in her pocket. Aaron. The thought of him, frail, vulnerable, made her feel sick. A sharp voice jolted her out of her thoughts. "Where's the chart for the new admit?" It was Deborah. Valerie's pulse quickened as she turned to see the woman rifling through files at the station. She'd only ever seen Deborah in passing, but today, something about her stood out. A little too clipped, a little too tense. "Excuse me," Valerie asked, feigning casual curiosity. "Which admit?" Deborah glanced at her, a flicker of annoyance crossing her face before it softened. "Baby girl. 5 pounds born last night. You seen her chart?" Valerie shook her head. "No, but I can check." Deborah smiled, thin, perfunctory, and walked off. Valerie's unease deepened as she watched her disappear down the hall. Why was she asking so much about one baby? If you heard this and feel this is the most touching story you heard today, please leave a comment. Chocolate. Hours later, Valerie sat in the break room, nursing a lukewarm coffee. Valerie's nerves felt taut and stretched thin. Every time Deborah entered the room, Valerie's gaze darted toward her. She tried to piece things together. Deborah's questions, her unusual focus on the new baby. She couldn't ignore it any longer. Rising from her chair, she slipped quietly out of the break room and followed Deborah down the hall. Deborah moved quickly, weaving through the maternity ward with an air of purpose. Valerie stayed a safe distance behind, ducking into empty rooms and around corners to avoid being seen. Her heart pounded louder with every step. Finally, Deborah stopped at the nursery window. She stood there, her arms crossed, scanning the rows of newborns with an intensity that sent a chill down Valerie's spine. Then she moved. Deborah entered the nursery, flashing her badge at the nurse inside. She exchanged a few words, and moments later, she was holding a tiny, swaddled baby. The baby girl she'd asked about earlier. Valerie's breath caught. This wasn't protocol. Nurses didn't carry babies out of the nursery without proper documentation. Deborah glanced around, her movements careful and deliberate. She turned toward the emergency exit at the far end of the hallway. Panic surged in Valerie's chest. She didn't think. She acted. "Deborah." The other woman froze, spinning on her heel. "What are you doing?" Valerie demanded, her voice steadier than she felt. "I was just taking her to her mother," Deborah said smoothly, but the flicker of something in her eyes betrayed her calm tone. "Which room?" Valerie crossed her arms, stepping closer. Deborah hesitated. The moment stretched too long. "That's what I thought," Valerie snapped. "Put her back." Deborah's jaw tightened, and for a moment Valerie thought she might push back. But then, with a forced smile, Deborah handed the baby to Valerie. "I was just trying to help. No need to get worked up." Valerie watched as Deborah walked away, her hands trembling as she cradled the baby. Once Deborah was out of sight, she handed the infant back to the nursery nurse, her mind racing. Deborah wasn't just suspicious. She was dangerous. That evening, back at the mansion, Valerie sat across from Richard in his study. The twins were asleep upstairs, their soft breaths caught on the monitors. The tranquility of the room stood in stark contrast to the turmoil swirling within her mind. "I need to tell you something," Valerie began, her voice low. Richard looked up from his desk, setting his pen down. "Go on." She hesitated, the weight of her secret heavy on her chest. "Reed. His people. They're not just watching us. They're moving. Today, at the hospital, there's someone on the inside. A nurse. Deborah." Richard's expression darkened. "What happened?" "She tried to take a baby," Valerie said, her voice trembling but firm. "She was going to walk out of the hospital with her. I stopped her, but—" She trailed off, gripping the armrest of her chair. Richard leaned forward, his voice calm but steely. "But what?" "I got a message," she admitted. "A warning. If I keep digging, they'll hurt my father." Richard's jaw tightened. "And you didn't tell me this earlier because—" "I didn't want to put him in more danger," she said, her voice breaking. "But I can't keep quiet anymore. They're getting bolder. If we don't act now—" Richard stood, pacing the room. His mind was already working, calculating the next move. "We'll protect Aaron," he said firmly, "and we'll stop Reed before he can do any more damage." Valerie exhaled shakily, her hands clutching the fabric of her pants. For the first time in days, she felt a flicker of hope, not because the danger had lessened, but because she wasn't facing it alone. The decision to act was made the moment Valerie confessed the threat to her father. Richard did not waste any time. The next morning, his study was bustling with activity. Maps of the city lay spread across the desk. Aaron's nursing home circled in bold red ink. Carlos stood beside Richard, his calm professionalism a steadying presence in the room. "I've already sent 2 men to scout the nursing home," Carlos began. "Security there is minimal. It's not built to fend off threats, and if Reed wants to make a statement, it wouldn't take much effort to breach." Richard's jaw tightened. "Then we don't give him the chance." He turned to Valerie, who sat silently in the corner, her face pale. "We'll bring Aaron here, where he's safe." Valerie hesitated, her fingers twisting the edge of her sweater. What if they're already watching him? Moving him might put him in more danger. Richard met her gaze, his voice firm, but not unkind. "Leaving him there is the greater risk. Reed knows how to exploit vulnerabilities, and right now, Aaron is the biggest one." She swallowed hard, but nodded, her trust in Richard growing with every decisive move he made. The nursing home was nestled in a quiet residential area, surrounded by trees that were just beginning to shed their autumn leaves. Richard's sleek black SUV arrived at the curb, trailed by another car that carried Carlos and 2 security operatives. Valerie sat in the passenger seat, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. He might not recognize me," she said quietly, her voice barely audible. Richard glanced at her. "That doesn't matter. What matters is getting him out safely." She nodded, drawing a shaky breath as Richard killed the engine. The entrance to the nursing home was unassuming, a single door with a small reception desk inside. Richard walked in first, his presence commanding, but not aggressive. The receptionist, an older woman with kind eyes, looked up and smiled. "Good morning. Can I help you?" "We're here to see Aaron," Richard said smoothly. "We'll be taking him home today." The receptionist frowned slightly. "That's a bit sudden. Is everything all right?" "Everything's fine," Richard assured her, his tone steady. "We've decided it's best for him to be with family." Valerie stepped forward, her voice soft but firm. "I'm his daughter. Please, let me see him." The receptionist hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "He's in the common room. I'll take you there." The common room was bright, filled with the muted chatter of residents and the faint hum of a television playing a midday game show. Valerie spotted Aaron near the window, sitting in a wheelchair, his gaze distant as he watched the leaves fall outside. "Dad," she said softly, stepping closer. Aaron turned slowly, his cloudy eyes narrowing as he tried to place her. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, and then his face broke into a faint smile. "Val?" She crouched beside him, her hands covering his. "It's me, Dad. We're taking you home." He blinked, confused. "Home? Why? I thought—" He trailed off, his thoughts slipping away. "It's okay," Valerie said, her voice thick with emotion. "Just trust me." Carlos coordinated the transfer with efficiency, ensuring they left no room for error. Within minutes, Aaron was settled into the SUV, a blanket tucked around him for warmth. Valerie sat beside him in the back seat, holding his hand tightly. Richard remained silent as he drove, his focus sharp. The sense of urgency hung heavy in the air, but the streets around them remained quiet. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were on them. As they approached the mansion, Carlos's voice came through on the radio. "All clear. Perimeter secure." Richard nodded, glancing at Valerie through the rearview mirror. "We're almost there." Back at the mansion, Aaron was settled into a room near the nursery where Valerie could stay close. Despite the looming threat of Reed, the sight of Aaron resting peacefully seemed to alleviate her burden. "I don't know how to thank you," she said to Richard later that evening, her voice soft. "You don't need to," he replied. "We're in this together." For the first time since arriving at the mansion, Valerie felt the faintest glimmer of hope. Richard's actions had shown her that she wasn't alone in this fight, and for the first time in a long time, she believed they might have a chance. Later that night, Carlos knocked on Richard's study door. "I have something," he said, stepping inside. Richard straightened. "What is it?" Carlos laid a file on the desk, spreading out photos and documents. "Deborah isn't just a nurse. She's been connected to several trafficking rings across the state, and her movements over the past month match closely with Reed's known patterns." Richard leaned over the desk, his eyes scanning the evidence. "Does it lead back to Reed directly?" "Not yet," Carlos admitted, "but it's close. We've traced her to a warehouse on the outskirts of the city. It's a known drop site for his operation." Richard's jaw tightened. "Then, that's where we start." The morning sun crept into the study, casting long shadows over the sprawling maps and pinned documents that had taken over Richard's once pristine workspace. Valerie stood near the window, the early light catching the worry lines etched deep into her face. She had barely slept, her thoughts bouncing between Aaron's fragile state and the chilling events at the hospital. "Coffee?" Richard's voice broke her thoughts as he handed her a cup. She accepted it with a small nod. "Thanks." Richard leaned against the desk, his gaze fixed on the diagram Carlos had laid out earlier. "We have a lead," he began, his tone calm but charged with purpose. "The warehouse Carlos identified is likely a central hub for Reed's operation." Valerie's grip tightened around the coffee mug. "So, what do we do?" Richard's sharp eyes met hers. "We dismantle it." Carlos arrived shortly after, a stack of folders tucked under his arm. He spread them out across the desk, revealing photographs, surveillance notes, and blueprints of the warehouse. Deborah's movements matched deliveries made to this location, Carlos explained, pointing to the map. "This isn't just a storage site, it's an exchange point. From here they move people and evidence to other locations." Valerie's stomach churned as she stared at the grainy photos. "Do we know who else is involved?" "Not yet," Carlos admitted. "But if we hit this place, we'll have enough to expose Reed's network, maybe even take it down." Richard crossed his arms, his expression unyielding. "Do we have enough to get the authorities involved?" "More than enough," Carlos said, sliding a folder toward him. "I've already reached out to a trusted contact at the precinct. They're ready to back us, but they'll need solid coordination." Valerie hesitated, her voice quieter than before. "And if Reed is there, what if he runs?" Richard turned to her, his voice steady. "We won't let him." As the day wore on, the study became a war room. Valerie, emboldened by the clear direction, threw herself into the planning. She reviewed hospital records and cross-referenced them with Carlos's data, searching for any additional links between Deborah and the warehouse. At one point, Richard noticed her hands trembling as she sifted through papers. "Take a break," he said firmly. "I'm fine," she replied, though her voice betrayed her exhaustion. "Valerie," Richard said, his tone softening, "you're doing enough. Let me take this for a while." Her shoulders slumped, and she set the papers down. I feel like this is my fault," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard frowned. "Why would you think that?" "If I hadn't run," she said, her hands twisting in her lap. "If I'd reported Reed sooner, maybe Megan wouldn't have died. Maybe Janet and Janice wouldn't have been left on your doorstep." Richard knelt beside her chair, his expression firm, but compassionate. "You did what you had to do to protect those girls. And now, because of you, we're close to stopping Reed. Don't carry blame that isn't yours." Her eyes glistened, but she nodded, the weight of his words grounding her. By evening, the team's plan had taken shape. Carlos detailed the raid to Richard and Valerie, using the blueprints to map out entry points and likely escape routes. "We'll coordinate with the authorities," Carlos said. "2 teams, one to secure the perimeter, another to breach the building. If Reed is there, we take him alive." "And the evidence?" Richard asked. Carlos tapped a folder. "We secure it before they have a chance to destroy anything. Their entire operation depends on this location staying hidden. If we expose it, we cripple them." Valerie watched the exchange, her confidence in the plan growing despite the risks. "What do you need me to do?" Carlos hesitated, glancing at Richard. "You've already done enough," Richard said gently. "No," Valerie insisted, her voice steady. "I need to see this through. Whatever you need, I'll do it." Richard studied her for a moment before nodding. "Then you'll stay here. We'll need someone to coordinate with the authorities from the mansion. If anything goes wrong, you'll be our fallback." She nodded, grateful for the chance to contribute without being in immediate danger. As the final details were ironed out, The weight of the coming operation settled over the room. Valerie stood by the window again, staring out into the darkening sky. Richard approached, his presence solid and reassuring. "You all right?" She turned to him, her expression determined. "I just want this to end." "It will," he said, "one way or another." She nodded, the flicker of fear in her eyes replaced by resolve. As the team disbanded for the night, Carlos pulled Richard aside. "There's one more thing," he said, his voice low. "Reed knows we're coming. I've intercepted chatter suggesting he's preparing to move the operation. If we don't act now, we might lose him." Richard's jaw tightened. "Then we make sure he doesn't." Outside, the night stretched long and quiet, but the air crackled with impending action. Somewhere, Reed was waiting, and the clock was ticking. The warehouse loomed in the distance, its corrugated metal walls barely visible under the moonless sky. Clouds hung low, muting the faint light from the stars. The tension inside the convoy of black SUVs was palpable, the low murmur of voices on the radio interspersed with the occasional click of weapons being checked. Richard sat in the front passenger seat of the lead vehicle, his gaze fixed ahead. Carlos drove, his face a mask of calm concentration. Valerie, against Richard's initial insistence, was in the back seat, her hands gripping her knees as she stared out the window. "You still think this is a good idea?" Richard asked, breaking the silence. "No," Valerie admitted, her voice steady despite the tightness in her chest. "But it's the right one." Richard glanced at her, his expression softening slightly. "Stay close. Allow us to take care of the difficult tasks." "I'm not here to watch," she said, her eyes meeting his in the rearview mirror. "I need to see this through." Carlos's voice cut through the tension. "We're close. Perimeter team is in position." The SUVs rolled to a stop, a block away from the warehouse, hidden behind an abandoned construction site. The perimeter team had already disabled the external cameras, and a quiet signal came through the radio. "All clear." The group exited their vehicles, moving silently. Richard led the team, his presence a steadying force as they approached the building. Valerie stayed near the back, flanked by 2 officers. The plan was simple, but risky. Secure the exits, breach the main floor, and take Reed alive if possible. Evidence was the priority. Shutting down the operation required irrefutable proof. Carlos motioned to the others, signaling the final approach. The heavy steel door of the warehouse loomed ahead, locked but poorly guarded. 2 guards stood near the entrance, smoking and chatting quietly, their posture betraying a lack of vigilance. A single hand signal from Carlos, and the guards were neutralized in seconds, silent takedowns that left no time for alarms. Inside, the warehouse was dimly lit, the air thick with the metallic tang of machinery and the faint hum of electricity. Stacks of crates lined the walls, marked with cryptic codes. A faint cry pierced the silence, soft, distant, and unmistakably human. Valerie's breath caught as she realized what it was. Children. Richard's jaw tightened. He motioned for the group to split. Carlos and a smaller team would secure the back, while Richard led the primary unit to the source of the cries. The corridors inside the warehouse were a maze, lined with shipping containers and makeshift offices. The cries grew louder as they moved deeper into the building. "Clear the crates," Richard ordered, his voice low but firm. Valerie followed closely, her eyes scanning every shadow. Then, from the corner of her vision, she saw a familiar figure. "Deborah," she whispered, her voice laced with disbelief. The nurse stood near a side door, a child in her arms, her face partially obscured by a scarf. Valerie didn't hesitate. "Stop!" she shouted, breaking from the group. Deborah turned, her eyes wide with panic, and bolted toward the exit. "Valerie, wait!" Richard said, but she was already running. The chase was short, but chaotic. Deborah shoved through a stack of crates, nearly toppling them over as she fled down a narrow corridor. Valerie pushed forward, her heart pounding as she closed the distance. "Put the child down!" Valerie yelled, her voice echoing off the metal walls. Deborah stumbled, her footing faltering just enough for Valerie to grab her arm. The child wailed, their cries sharp and desperate. "You don't understand," Deborah hissed, her face twisted with desperation. "If I don't deliver, you're delivering them to monsters," Valerie snapped, her grip unyielding. "Let her go." Deborah hesitated, her resolve crumbling under Valerie's glare. Slowly, she set the child down, raising her hands in surrender. Before Valerie could react further, 2 officers appeared, securing Deborah and taking the child to safety. Meanwhile, Richard and Carlos reached the center of the warehouse, where Keith Reed stood waiting. He was flanked by 2 armed guards, his expression calm, almost amused. "Mr. Clark," Reed said, his voice smooth. "I have to admit, I didn't expect you to come personally. Admirable, if not a bit foolish." Richard stepped forward, unarmed but radiating authority. "This ends tonight, Reed." Reed chuckled, shaking his head. "You think this little operation matters? You're only grazing the surface of a much larger issue than you realize." "Then we'll keep digging," Richard replied, his tone icy. Reed's smile faltered. Before he could respond, Carlos and his team moved in, disarming the guards and securing Reed in moments. As they cuffed him, Reed leaned close to Richard, his voice low but chilling. "You think you've won? My connections go deeper than you can imagine. This won't stop me." Richard didn't flinch. "We'll see." The warehouse was cleared within the hour. Children and evidence were escorted to safety, while Reed and his associates were taken into custody. Valerie stood outside, her breath fogging in the cold night air. She watched as Reed was loaded into a police van, his expression unreadable, but his words still ringing in her ears. Richard approached, placing a steady hand on her shoulder. "It's over," he said softly. "For now," Valerie replied, her voice steady but tinged with unease. "But he's right, isn't he? This is bigger than just him." Richard nodded, his gaze distant. "We'll deal with that when the time comes. For now, we've done what we needed to." As the police convoy pulled away, Reed's chilling smile lingered in Valerie's mind. Somewhere, his network remained active, and she knew this was only part of this story. The courtroom was sterile, clinical in its harsh lighting and rigid atmosphere. Valerie sat on the witness stand, her hands trembling in her lap as she gazed at Keith Reed, who sat just feet away. His face, usually a mask of smug confidence, now carried a slight edge of tension. The room was quiet, but the silence hummed with anticipation. Valerie took a deep breath, her mind running through the events she was about to recount. It was hard to separate the events of the past months from the present moment. The faces of the children, the sound of Reed's voice, and the image of Deborah trying to escape all swirled in her mind. But she was here, and she had to finish what she had started. She couldn't let fear stop her now. The prosecutor, a woman with sharp eyes and a steady hand, looked to Valerie and nodded. "Please take your time, Miss Harris," she said gently. Valerie cleared her throat, steadying herself. She turned her gaze to the jury, trying to find strength in their eyes. "It started with Megan," Valerie began, her voice quieter than she intended. "She was just 23, and she was hospitalized alone. There was no family. No one. Just her and those 2 little girls inside of her." She paused, the memory of Megan's face flashing in her mind. "I didn't know her well, but I could tell something wasn't right. She was scared, but she said nothing. She was just waiting for something. I didn't know what. Valerie's eyes flicked to Reed for a moment. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The delivery was complicated, she continued, her voice wavering but resolute. Megan lost too much blood. We tried everything, but she died. Her voice caught in her throat as she looked down. Before she passed, Megan said one thing to me. Keep them safe. Her gaze shifted back to Reed. His eyes were cold, but there was a flicker of something deeper there, something more sinister. Valerie's hands shook as she clasped them tightly together. I didn't know what she meant at first. I was just a nurse. But then I overheard Reed and his people. They were talking about plans to take Janet and Janice as soon as they were born. Sell them. They were already targeting orphans, vulnerable children, to use for God knows what. A murmur passed through the courtroom. The prosecutor nodded, urging Valerie to continue. I knew I couldn't just let them fall into his hands, Valerie said, her voice strong now. So I ran. I couldn't trust the authorities, not with Reed's people everywhere. I took the twins, and I fled. I didn't know where to go. But then I saw Richard Clark's name in the papers, his work with orphans, his donations. I thought maybe, just maybe, he could help. She paused again, her breath steadying. However, Reed consistently remained one step ahead. I didn't know how deep he was involved until I saw him, until I heard his voice myself. Valerie shifted uncomfortably, remembering the night she'd confronted Deborah. I saw Deborah. She was involved. She tried to take another child at the hospital. I knew then that I couldn't run anymore. I couldn't let this happen to anyone else. The prosecutor turned to Reed, whose gaze had not left Valerie for a second. What did Reed say when you confronted him? The prosecutor asked, her voice rising with purpose. He said I was too late, Valerie said, her voice unwavering now. He said his connections were too deep to stop, that I could never end it, that his network was bigger than just this operation. Richard, who had been standing quietly in the back of the room, stepped forward slightly, his presence a silent promise of protection. Valerie caught his eye, feeling a momentary surge of gratitude. The memories of those dark nights, the fear of Reed's network, all of it seemed distant now. She wasn't alone anymore. Carlos stepped up, handing over the evidence gathered from the raid, photographs, documents, and recorded conversations that tied Reed directly to multiple trafficking operations across the state. This evidence, Carlos explained to the jury, links Keith Reed and his associates to a network of exploitation and organized crime. We have proof of his involvement with children, the operations, and even his attempt to flee when he knew we were closing in. Reed's face hardened, but he said nothing. The walls were closing in. The prosecutor turned back to Valerie, her voice soft but firm. And what would you say now, Miss Harris, after everything you've been through? Valerie inhaled deeply. I'd say that, no matter how far he tries to hide, no matter how deep his connections go, I'm not afraid of him anymore. I'm not running anymore. I've faced my fears, and now we stop him. For good. The room was still for a moment. Reed's eyes narrowed as he sat back in his seat, realizing the magnitude of what he had lost. Valerie felt the weight of the moment. This was it. This was her moment of closure, the final step in her journey. The judge looked down at the evidence, then up at Reed. You are hereby convicted on all charges, he declared, his voice steady. You will be held accountable for your crimes. The courtroom erupted in a murmur, but Valerie remained still. Her hands, no longer trembling, rested quietly in her lap. The fear that had plagued her for so long seemed distant now, vanishing in the wake of this victory. Outside, The bright light of day flooded through the courtroom windows. Reed and his network were behind bars, their power shattered. Valerie stood tall as she walked out of the courtroom, Richard beside her. Janet and Janice, now safe, would soon be able to live the lives they deserved, and for the first time in a long time, Valerie knew that they could all finally move on. Valerie felt the weight of the past release from her shoulders as the doors closed behind them. The battle had been won, but a part of her knew that, for her, this was only the beginning of a new chapter. The sun shone brightly through the large windows of Richard's mansion, casting a golden glow over the spacious living room. The soft murmur of children's laughter echoed from the garden, blending with the chirping of birds. It was a peaceful afternoon, one that Valerie had long dreamed of. But today, it felt like the beginning of something far more significant than a quiet day. Inside the study, Richard sat at his desk, reviewing the final adoption papers for Janet and Janice. His pen moved across the documents with precision, signing his name for the last time. The girls, now legally his daughters, were no longer just symbols of a promise. They were family. His family. Valerie stood at the doorway, watching him with a small smile. She had been quiet today, the weight of the past finally starting to lift from her shoulders. She had never imagined this moment, yet here it was, an unspoken promise fulfilled. The twins were safe, and their future was secure. Richard glanced up and caught her eye, his expression softening. "It's done," he said, his voice tinged with relief. "They're officially ours." Valerie crossed the room, her hands folded together as she joined him at the desk. "I think it's about time we start calling ourselves a family, don't you?" Richard smiled. "I think that's exactly what they are." Later that afternoon, the house was alive with activity. The garden, once an empty space, now felt like a playground. Janet and Janice, giggling as they chased each other, embodied the essence of the moment. Valerie and Richard stood together near the garden, watching them run with carefree abandon. Valerie couldn't remember the last time she had seen such joy, not just in the twins, but in herself. She had come so far since the days of fear, running from the past, but now the future felt full of possibilities. "They're amazing," Valerie said, her voice filled with admiration as she watched the girls tumble into the soft grass. Richard glanced at her, his smile more than just a reflection of happiness. There was an understanding between them, something that had grown over the months. "You're incredible too. You've shown them what it means to be loved, Valerie." Valerie turned to him, her heart full as she absorbed his words. "I didn't do it alone," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "It took all of us." For a brief moment, the weight of everything they had been through hung in the air between them. But it was different now. It wasn't a burden. It was the bond they had formed, one that neither of them could have predicted. A future that they would share together. Later that evening, as the girls sat down for dinner, Valerie took a quiet moment to herself in the kitchen. She leaned against the counter, letting the sounds of laughter and chatter from the dining room wash over her. Aaron, who had been more stable in the days following the raid, was sitting at the table with the family. His once distant gaze now filled with warmth. Valerie thought about how far they had come, how much had changed. She had feared for so long that the darkness would swallow everything, that there would be no end to the nightmare. However, now that Aaron was by her side and the twins were safe, she could perceive the light. She could see a future, her future, shaped by love, stability, and the chance to give back. Richard stepped into the kitchen, holding a glass of wine in his hand. "You okay?" he asked, his tone gentle. Valerie smiled, feeling the comfort of his presence. "I'm more than okay. I'm happy. For the first time in a long time, I can honestly say that. He raised his glass to her. To new beginnings. To new beginnings, she echoed, clinking her glass gently against his. The final scene of the evening took place outside, under the clear sky, where the family gathered together in the garden. The air was cool but pleasant, and the garden lights cast a soft glow over the small group. The twins were playing with a ball, their laughter echoing in the quiet evening. Valerie and Richard watched them from the patio, a quiet understanding between them. As the evening wore on, Valerie crouched down and pulled the twins close. Janet, the more inquisitive of the two, tugged at Valerie's sleeve. "Are we safe now, Mummy?" she asked, her wide eyes searching for reassurance. Valerie's heart swelled as she cupped Janet's face in her hands. "Yes, sweetheart, you're safe now, and nothing will ever change that." She glanced up at Richard, her gaze filled with gratitude. "You're home. And it's safe." Richard stood nearby, watching them with a look of quiet determination. His family, his new family, was now secure, and with that certainty, he knew he would protect them, no matter what. As Valerie whispered softly to the girls, her heart filled with the kind of peace she hadn't known in years. The darkness that had once seemed inescapable had been replaced by the bright promise of a future, one they would all build together. Richard joined them in the garden, his arm wrapping around Valerie's shoulders. The family, now complete, stood together in the warmth of the evening light. It was a new beginning for all of them, a chance to heal, to love, and to grow. As the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, Valerie whispered to the girls, "It's safe now." And Richard, standing strong beside her, looked on with a renewed sense of purpose. He had fought for this family, and he would protect it at all costs. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. Share your feelings with us, and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values, yet entertaining. See you there.